Before getting into detail about different design patterns, it's interesting to know a little bit about the history that led to its creation. It might come as a surprise that the story does not originate in the field of computer science, but rather in architecture. And when we say architecture, we're not referring to the architecture of computer systems, but to the architecture of buildings. In 1977, Christopher Alexander, together with other authors, published the book A Pattern Language: Towns, Buildings, Construction. In the book, Alexander uses an original approach to analyse architecture. Alexander does not go into detail of the construction processes related to architecture, but instead, his approach is to identify what essential problems an architect must face. He tries to express these problems or concepts in the most general way possible, and therefore making what he deems as general and timeless as possible. In addition, and this is very important, despite his effort to identify the different essential concepts to describe them in isolation, it provides the main ideas of how they relate to one another. This double contribution, identifying and isolating the fundamental concepts, together with establishing how they relate to each other, led to the creation of a new language, which can be used to express questions that appear when we face an architectural project. The book, although it didn't have big impact on building architecture, has ended up being very important in the history of programming. The study of a language is carried out in 3 different areas: vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. As we said, the book tries to create a language that serves to express the ideas in the field of architecture. In this language, the role of vocabulary is to interpret the different sets of basic concepts that make up the collection of patterns. The grammar, which in a language indicates the form of the words, would be in the description that the book offers for each pattern. And finally, the syntax, which studies how sentences are structured with the words it contains, which would be the equivalent to the relationship established between the presented patterns. To understand the basic idea, here's an example. Here we see Alexander's definition of a house cluster. The concept house cluster would be a new word in the vocabulary that forms the language. Alexander explains the essentials of the concept by indicating how people need houses to have certain groupings, but without the owners feeling that their property is invaded. This would be the grammar. And just as the syntax studies how different words with different rows come together to form a sentence, the pattern indicates that other patterns collaborate with the house cluster when a specific neighbourhood or urbanisation is formed. In 1987, 2 of the illustrious names in the field of programming, Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham, showed interest in the application of Alexander's ideas in the field of software. His ideas were published in papers in different computer conventions. However, the takeoff of these concepts outside the academic field did not occur until 1994, when one of the most influential books in the history of programming was published. Design Patterns: Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. The authors of this book were Eric Gamma, Richard Helm, Ralph Johnson, and John Vlissides, although they are commonly referred to as the Gang of Four, or GOF. The book presents a catalogue of 23 situations that appear repeatedly when we build complex systems in an object-oriented language, and it offers a solution for each of them. Each of these 23 solution strategies is called a pattern. A fundamental part of the language, as the authors recognise, is to name each of these 23 patterns, facilitating the creation of a common vocabulary shared by all programmers. The 23 patterns are grouped into 3 categories, depending on the type of problem they refer to. 1. How objects are created. 2. How relationships are structured between them. Or 3. How they behave. Each of the patterns is explained in detail, following the same structure. The pattern begins with the intent, briefly indicating the purpose of the pattern, and if necessary, indicating a name that is also usually used for this pattern, a typical application scenario, etc. As we discussed earlier, the patterns are grouped into 3 categories, and as we can see, there are 5 creational, 7 structural, and 11 behavioural patterns. And now that we know a little bit about the history behind one of the most influential ideas in the field of software engineering, we can begin the detailed study of each of these 23 patterns.